Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to look at Donald Trump's proposed 2025 tariffs. Yeah, you heard that right. Tariffs round two, the sequel no one asked for, but the one we might just get. So to help us break down this potential economic earthquake, we're diving into excerpts from a fictional podcast called Economic Edge. And let me tell you, these guys are not messing around. They're calling this Tariffs 2.0, dramatic music, the whole nine yards. It's like they're setting the stage for an economic thriller.
Tariffs 2.0. It does have a certain ring to it, doesn't it? And they're really leaning into that sequel angle. Like they're trying to say, buckle up, things are about to get even crazier than before.
Oh, for sure. So Economic Edge lays out Trump's tariff plan as having three main parts. First, a blanket 10% tariff on all imports. We're talking everything, from that new phone you've been wanting to the car you've got your eye on. Then on top of that, a 60% surcharge specifically on Chinese EVs, semiconductors, and steel. And to round it all out, they're proposing subsidies for U.S. manufacturers to bring jobs back home. So yeah, a lot to unpack there. What's your initial reaction to all of this?
Well, it's certainly ambitious. And it really aligns with that America First approach we saw during Trump's previous presidency. The podcast really hammers on this idea of reshoring, bringing manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. And I can see how that would appeal to a lot of people, especially those who feel like globalization has left them behind. But the question Economic Edge keeps coming back to is this really a path to economic prosperity? Or is it more like a road to economic ruin? They actually used the phrase economic suicide at one point. So yeah, pretty dramatic stuff.
Yeah, they don't sugarcoat it. And they bring up some pretty serious potential consequences, too. Inflation, obviously, a possible trade war with China, and disruptions to global supply chains. There's this one detail they mentioned that really stuck with me, a leaked Walmart memo predicting a 15% price hike on electronics because of the tariffs. Imagine that. Your $1,000 phone suddenly costs $1,150.
Oh, yeah, that would definitely sting for a lot of people. And it highlights how these tariffs could really fuel inflation. Those tariffs essentially act as a tax on imported goods. So businesses have to pay more to bring their products in. And you know what happens next? They pass those costs on to the consumer, which means higher prices for everyone. And then there's the whole trade war thing. If China decides to retaliate with tariffs of their own, things could spiral pretty quickly. We saw a glimpse of that back in 2018. Remember the soybean bans and the restrictions on rare earth minerals? Yeah, things could get messy fast.
It's like setting off a chain reaction, right? An Economic Edge also dives into who stands to win and who might lose big if these tariffs actually go into effect. They suggest that U.S. steelmakers and automakers could see some benefits, and I imagine some voters would be happy about those moves, especially those who feel like certain industries need more protection. But then you've got consumers facing higher prices on pretty much everything, exporters like farmers and tech companies potentially losing business, and even our allies like the EU and Japan could feel the squeeze.
Absolutely. Yeah. The impact wouldn't be felt equally. Some would gain while others definitely lose out. And it's interesting because the podcast brought up this case study about Harley-Davidson. Remember, after the 2018 tariffs, they actually ended up shifting some of their production overseas. It makes you wonder, could we see that happen again? Will companies just find ways to avoid these tariffs, even if it means going against this whole reshoring idea? And if they do, what happens to the American workers these tariffs are supposed to protect?
It's a good question. It really makes you realize how complicated this whole Tariffs 2.0 thing is. It's not just about economics, it's about geopolitics and global relationships, too. And speaking of global reactions, Economic Edge reported on some pretty strong responses from around the world. Apparently, China has vowed to defend its interests, which a lot of people are interpreting as a threat of retaliatory tariffs. They even hinted at targeting specific sectors of the U.S. economy like airplane manufacturing, soybean farming, even Hollywood. It's like they're saying we know where it hurts.
Yeah.
And the EU isn't too happy either, with leaders using words like economic aggression to describe these proposed tariffs.
Yeah, the possibility of a global trade war is a huge concern.
Yeah.
And Economic Edge also brought up something else that I found fascinating: the potential impact on the WTO, the World Trade Organization. It's an institution that's already been facing challenges. And if these tariff battles escalate, it could become even more marginalized, maybe even irrelevant. And that makes you wonder, could this be a turning point for how global trade is governed? Are we headed towards a world where everyone's just looking out for themselves, or can we find a way to cooperate and make sure trade is fair for everyone?
Those are some big questions. And it really drives home the point that this isn't just about numbers and theories. It's about people's lives, their jobs, their hopes for the future. Economic Edge actually included these hypothetical sound bites from people who could be directly impacted by these tariffs. They had a factory worker in Ohio who was hopeful that the tariffs would protect his job, but then they also had a small business owner who was worried that the increased costs would force him to shut down.
It's those human stories that really highlight how complex this whole situation is. It's easy to get lost in the abstract discussions about trade policy, but at the end of the day, these decisions have very real consequences for people on the ground. It's interesting how this whole thing really shows you how connected everything is.
It does. Yeah. We've been talking about the big picture stuff, the global trade, the inflation, the relationships between countries. But we can't forget about the individual stories, the way this could impact people's lives in all sorts of unexpected ways.
Right. It's a good reminder that these aren't just abstract ideas we're talking about. They have real-world consequences for real people.
Absolutely. And that's what makes these deep dives so important, I think. We're not just skimming the surface here. We're really trying to understand all the different angles, the complexities, the potential outcomes.
I totally agree. It's about connecting the dots, seeing how one decision can set off a whole chain reaction that ripples throughout the entire system.
So let's zoom back in on Tariffs 2.0 for a minute. We've got those three core elements that Economic Edge laid out. The universal tariff on all imports, the big surcharge aimed at China, and then the subsidies for bringing manufacturing back to the U.S.
Right, those three elements. They all work together to create this very particular economic strategy. It's about protectionism, bringing jobs back home, and reducing our reliance on global supply chains, especially the ones coming from China.
It's almost like building walls instead of bridges, economically speaking at least. But like we've been talking about, those walls might have some cracks. Economic Edge paints a pretty bleak picture of what could happen. If things go wrong, a global trade war, a weakened World Trade Organization.
And don't forget about the possibility of things going sideways in ways we haven't even thought of yet. Remember the Harley-Davidson thing? Sometimes these protectionist moves can totally backfire and end up hurting the very industries they're supposed to help.
It's like messing with a delicate ecosystem, right?
Yep.
You think you're making one small change, but then it has all these ripple effects you can't even predict.
It's a balancing act, for sure. And it's not just about the economics either. There's this whole political angle to it, too, with Trump calling it economic patriotism.
Yeah.
It really taps into this idea of America getting back to its manufacturing roots, putting American workers first.
Yeah, it definitely resonates with some people, but is it really sustainable in the long run? Economic Edge seemed pretty doubtful, especially with the possibility of China retaliating and pushback from our allies in the EU.
It's a valid concern for sure, and it just shows how complex this whole thing is. There are so many moving pieces, so many competing interests, that it's really tough to predict what will happen in the end.
So are we basically saying there's no easy answer here?
I think that's a fair assessment. There are strong arguments on both sides, and the potential consequences are pretty huge. It's not a simple right or wrong kind of situation. There's way more nuance than that.
Which makes it even more important to really unpack these issues and have these conversations. We can't just rely on sound bites and political slogans.
Absolutely. We have to engage with this stuff critically, think about the different perspectives, and then form our own opinions based on the facts.
And I think that's what Economic Edge is trying to do with this fictional podcast. They're laying out a scenario, exploring the different ways it could play out, and then letting the listeners decide what they think.
It's a smart approach, and it really gets people thinking beyond simple slogans, makes them grapple with the complexity of it all.
I like that. So for a listener who's been with us on this deep dive, what would you say is the most important thing to take away from all this? What should they be thinking about as they process this information?
The key takeaway, I think, is that this is a really complex issue with no easy answers. There are valid points to be made on both sides, and the potential consequences are far-reaching. It's important to look at this information with a critical eye, weigh the different perspectives, and then come to your own conclusions based on a solid understanding of what's at stake.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's about going beyond the headlines and really digging into the substance of these policies.
It's about understanding how these decisions could impact not just the overall economy, but also individual lives, communities, and the world as a whole.
So it's not just about Tariffs 2.0, it's about the future we're creating, both here at home and on a global scale.
Absolutely. And I think that's a perfect place to leave things for now.
You're right. When we come back, we'll continue exploring Tariffs 2.0, looking at some potential scenarios and what this could all mean for the future of the global economy. Stick with us. And we're back. Still digging into this whole Tariffs 2.0 situation. It's a lot to process, right?
It really is. Trying to figure out what's going to happen with these tariffs is kind of like trying to predict the weather. So many factors involved, so much uncertainty. It's tough to say for sure how it's all going to shake out.
Economic Edge definitely seemed to be leaning into that uncertainty, especially when it came to the possibility of an all-out trade war. Like, what happens if China really does retaliate with those tariffs? What would that even look like in 2025?
Well, based on what we've seen in the past, it probably wouldn't be pretty. You could easily see this kind of back and forth escalation, where each side just keeps raising tariffs higher and higher. And it might not just stay between the U.S. and China either. It could pull in other countries, other trade alliances. You could end up with shortages of certain goods, prices going through the roof, and the whole global economy could slow down as a result.
And Economic Edge specifically mentioned China going after U.S. planes, soybeans, and even Hollywood movies with those retaliatory tariffs. It sounds like they'd be hitting some pretty sensitive spots.
Oh, absolutely. Those are strategic targets.
Yeah.
China knows exactly which parts of the U.S. economy would hurt the most if they were hit with tariffs. It's a classic tit-for-tat move.
Okay.
And the unfortunate thing is that it's often the everyday consumers and businesses that end up paying the price when these kinds of trade wars break out.
So it's not just about who wins the trade war. It's about all the damage that gets done along the way, right? But let's say for a minute that these tariffs actually do what Trump wants them to do. Let's say they bring manufacturing jobs back, they boost U.S. industry, and they create that America First economy he keeps talking about. Is that even realistic?
I mean, it's not impossible, but I think it's probably a lot more complicated than that. The tariffs can provide some temporary protection for certain industries, but they also tend to drive up prices for consumers, and they can actually stifle innovation too. And then there's always the chance of those unintended consequences we were talking about earlier. You know, companies might find ways to get around the tariffs altogether.
Yeah.
Maybe they shift production to other countries, or consumers might just decide to buy cheaper products from somewhere else. It's really hard to say how it'll all play out.
So even if things go well, there could still be downsides, unforeseen problems. It's not as simple as just flipping a switch and bringing back the good old days of manufacturing, right?
Exactly. There's no easy fix when it comes to trade policy. It's all about finding the right balance. And that usually means making tough choices with compromises on both sides.
Which brings us back to that Trump quote that Economic Edge used at the end of their episode. You know, the one about trade wars being good and easy to win. Do you think that's still true in 2025?
Well, I think history has shown us pretty clearly that trade wars are almost never good, and they're definitely not easy to win. The world has changed a lot since 2018. The stakes are even higher now. And a trade war today could have some really serious consequences, way more complex and potentially more damaging than ever before.
It's a lot to think about. So for our listener who's been following along with us on this deep dive, what would you say are the key things to watch for? As this Tariffs 2.0 thing plays out, what should they be paying attention to?
I would say keep an eye on how other countries react, especially China and the EU. Are they going to retaliate? What kind of actions are they going to take? And what impact will that have on global trade and those supply chains we keep talking about? Those are the things that could really change the game.
Good points. Anything else you want to leave our listener with as we wrap up this deep dive?
I think the most important thing is to stay informed, have those tough conversations, and try to see this issue from different perspectives. Trade policy might seem like it's just about economics, but it really affects all of us in some pretty significant ways. So it's worth taking the time to really understand what's going on and form your own opinions.
I couldn't agree more. Well, there you have it, folks. Your deep dive into Tariffs 2.0 is complete. We've explored the potential impacts, the risks, the possible benefits, and all the uncertainty that comes with these proposed tariffs. It's a complex situation, and things are constantly changing, so keep learning, keep exploring. And thanks for joining us.